Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome from London. My name's Pepe Martinez, and I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide, and I'm one of 600 members of the Association of Professional Tour Guides, and we manage the Guide London live broadcasts and the Guide London website. So Merry Christmas to wherever you are, wherever you're joining us from today. And if you're joining us from a place somewhere in the world, do let us know in chat, and maybe we can send greetings to you towards the end. Now, we've got a very special broadcast for you today, and I'm going to invite my esteemed colleague Simon to help me with today's special Christmas broadcast. What have you got in store for us today, Simon?
Well, good afternoon, Pepe. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, joining us from all over the world today. What have I got in store for us? Well, I don't think Christmas is Christmas without the inimitable Charles Dickens. And every year I make it a point to reread A Christmas Carol. And I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit later on some of the secrets behind the greatest ghost story ever written.
Fabulous. Thank you, Simon. I look forward to it. And in fact, to all our viewers, back in July, I actually approached Simon and said, Simon, I think people are going to want some holiday content. Perhaps we should get together and come up with something. So what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is give you a little preview of a virtual tour that we've been doing for about the last month, which is a little longer than we have today, about 2 hours with an interval. So I'm going to be starting with Act 1, and I'm going to give you a few of the British traditions at Christmas that we celebrate in this country. And I'm going to put the premise out there. I'm going to suggest to you that there's a case to be had that the modern British Christmas traditions, and many of the famous ones, were invented or created in just 6 short years between 1843 and 1848. And you're probably thinking, what is he talking about? He must be crazy. Well, let's have a look and see what we've got in store for you. Simon, we'll see you just a little bit later. Thank you for joining us. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's get on. And we're going to begin with something that I think is quintessentially British, although if you live in Australia, New Zealand or Canada or several other Commonwealth countries, you might have heard of the Christmas cracker. Now, for those of you that have never heard of a Christmas cracker, there's a couple on the screen for you. Imagine the inside of maybe a toilet roll. Inside, some silly little trinkets or toys, perhaps a paper hat. But most importantly, of course, you've got the Christmas joke. And if you have any good Christmas cracker jokes, do put them in chat for us, and we'll read some of the best ones out at the end. But most importantly, a little mechanism that when pulled across the dining table on Christmas Day with one of your nearest and dearest will create the crack that gives the cracker its name. Now, who invented the Christmas cracker? Well, it was a humble confectioner's apprentice by the name of Tom Smith, and here he is on the screen. In 1847, he was sent to Paris to an exposition to bring back some products for their growing confectionery candy business, sweet business back home. And he came upon some almond bonbons that had been wrapped in tissue paper and the ends had been twisted. And he thought this would be a great product to bring back home, and so he did. And then they were launched onto the British public and they became very successful. Eventually, sales begin to wane, and so he got the idea of putting little love notes, little messages inside, perhaps the forerunner to the Christmas cracker joke that we have today. And again, sales began to wane. Now, the legendary story tells us that in Christmas 1850, he was sitting at home, sitting by a log fire, and he was listening to the crackle of the wood in the fire, and this sparks an idea in him. And so he goes into the laboratory and he creates a mechanism that when pulled, so when the bonbons were opened, they would make some kind of noise. And that is the forerunner to the modern day Christmas cracker that we know and love so much today. Now, I actually wrote to Tom Smith and Co, and they gave me permission to show you some of their old advertising. And they didn't just advertise, create crackers for Christmas. They also created crackers for world events, including, would you believe, the invention of motorized vehicles, the Paris Exposition of 1900, the end of World War I in 1918, and who can forget their fantastic collection known as Frolicsome Frogs from 1907. So crackers for all events, including birthdays. By 1907, by the way, he had a huge factory, or his grandkids had a huge factory in the city of London, employing more than 2,000 people, including a lot of women. A high female workforce. So this is what an original set of Tom Smith crackers looks like. They were actually tiny. I was doing a virtual tour last week and somebody actually had an original antique box of them. And last year at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the largest decorative arts museum in the world, they had an entire exhibition devoted to the Christmas cracker. Now, it's not too late to get on Amazon and order yourself a box if you have not bought your crackers this year. Let's just have a look at a few crackers on the market this year. And so let's start with the best. Tom Smith, they still exist, founded in 1847. And if you look at the top of the screen, you'll notice they have a royal warrant. So they supply Christmas crackers to Her Majesty the Queen. And you think they're going to be expensive, but no, you can see it on the screen. They sell on Amazon. A box of Tom Smith Christmas crackers, £19.99. Now, if you've got a slightly bigger budget, let's just have a look at some of the Christmas crackers that were available this year. A box of 6 from Fortnum & Mason's, their majestic cracker box, £1,000. Or slightly cheaper, a box of 6 from Asprey will cost you £725. A box of 6 from Harrods, their average box will cost you £125. But the granddaddy of all of the Christmas crackers this year were the Royal Mint, who sold a box of 6 Christmas crackers, wait for it, for £5,000. Apparently, one of the crackers contains a 1-ounce gold bar. So there we go. People with more money than sense purchasing those, I would think. Now, just while we're talking about crackers, the largest cracker ever created was built by the parents of a school in Buckinghamshire. It was 203 feet long and 13 feet in diameter. It's about, what is that in meters? That's about 4 meters in diameter. Absolutely huge. So there we go. The Christmas cracker, invented by Tom Smith in 1847. We're now going to move on to a tradition that I'm sure many of you will have in your own countries, of course, the Christmas tree. And more than anything that I'm going to talk about today, we can go back further in time talking about the humble Christmas tree. In fact, thousands of years before Christianity, pagans would worship on the 21st of December, the shortest day of the year. Did you worship yesterday? Knowing that the days were now going to get longer, and they would decorate their homes with fir and evergreen. So also the Romans decorated their temples. The winter festival of Saturnalia, they decorated their temples with fir as well. And also in medieval times, we had mystery plays, performances usually at Christmas, going from town to town, village to village. And often the centerpiece of their performances would be a tree, sometimes referred to as the paradise tree. These trees would often be hung with apples, relating, of course, to the feast day of Adam and Eve on the 24th of December. And some historians have suggested that, of course, the hanging of apples on a tree was the forerunner of the modern day bauble. Now, I could talk about trees all day. If you're particularly interested in the history of Christmas trees, an absolute nerd fest is the book that's scrolling up now. It's called Christmas, a Biography by Judith Flanders. I got quite a lot of my facts out of this one book, actually. And she really does a lot of detail and a lot of research on tracing the development of the decorated Christmas tree through medieval Europe, particularly Germany. But let's bring it back to Britain. Now, who created or who popularized the idea of a decorated tree in the German style in this country? I'm sure many of you will probably go for Albert and Victoria, Queen Victoria and her consort Prince Albert. However, if we go back a little further to 1800, Queen Charlotte, the wife and consort of King George III, threw a party for all of the first families of Windsor over the Christmas holidays, and one of them writes in their diaries about seeing a tree in the German style for Christmas. And so this is the first time we ever see a decorated Christmas tree in this country. The first time we ever see a decorated Christmas tree in publishing in this country was on the cover of a book from 1836. You can see it on the screen now. By the way, all of these images are from Wiki Commons, or they're my own images, and I've been given permission to use them from friends as well, actually, particularly Amanda. I'll talk about Amanda in a moment. But This is the most important image that I'm going to show you with regards to the Christmas tree, because when this image was published in the London Illustrated News in 1848, it caused an absolute sensation. And so on the right, you've got Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. There's Queen Victoria, one of our longest reigning monarchs. And look at this fabulous decorated tree here and their lovely children. So it didn't just cause a sensation in this country, it also caused a sensation in the United States as well. And just to give you an idea, in popular culture, this idea that Albert really kind of invented the idea of a decorated Christmas tree. When Albert died tragically young in 1861, most of his obituaries mentioned this idea of Albert either inventing or popularizing the decorated Christmas tree. So that's 1848. We're going to move on to another tradition now. I'm sure this is something that you all do. Before we get there, though, I think you deserve it. I think I need to show you a few decorated trees around London. I don't know about you. Of course, I'm missing not guiding on the streets. And perhaps some of you had plans to come to London this Christmas. Perhaps some of you have been here before. Let me just show you a couple of the best. Now, symbolically, the tree that you're looking at in Trafalgar Square is the most important. Trafalgar Square, symbolically the heart of London, named after the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, Nelson defeating Napoleon. Now, the tree that you're looking at has been on display every year permanently since 1947. And a lot of children, when they see this tree, they're a little bit disappointed because it's not very bling. It only has 500 lights, and we're told that it is decorated in the Norwegian style. Now, what's the connection to Norway, I hear you ask? Well, in 1942, King Haakon II of Norway, who had left his country, had taken refuge in London and been given refuge by the British government because his country had been occupied by the Nazis. The people of Norway secretly cut down a Norwegian spruce, sent it secretly to the king to remind him of home, and he was so touched by the generosity of the British government and the people of London that he gave it to London. And so that was the first time a tree had ever gone up in Trafalgar Square. But the first ceremony, and it's a ceremony that happens every year, started in 1947. And there you can see the very first ceremony from 1947. We normally get carol singers around the base of the tree raising money for charity. And so symbolically, that is the most important tree in London. Just a couple of other trees for you. Now, my second favorite tree is normally at Somerset House. So what I love about this tree, if you look carefully, you can see these Christmas hampers, Fortnum and Mason's Christmas hampers. Fortnum and Mason's, one of the most famous department stores in London, although unfortunately they normally have an indoor winter's fair every year at Somerset House. Not happening this year, but we'll be back next year, we hope. And then my favorite tree in London every year is the 60-foot, the 20-meter tall tree in Covent Garden Piazza. 30,000 lights and ornaments in this incredible tree. And for those of you that know the musical My Fair Lady, of course, this is where the famous square where Henry Higgins meets Eliza Doolittle at the beginning of Pygmalion and later My Fair Lady, the musical. If you go into the market building, you'll see the largest baubles and the largest sprigs of holly anywhere in London. But I've got one more tree to show you. Now, just a couple of more trees, excuse me. So this is the Natural History Museum. Notice they do an ice rink around their tree every year. Sadly, no ice rink this year. And our penultimate tree now. This is a fairly new tree, thanks to Amanda, my lovely colleague, for giving me this fantastic picture. So this is the south bank of the River Thames, and look at the incredible skyline of the city. See the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral and the skyline of the financial centre. But I've got one more tree for you just before we move on. Does anybody recognize where we are in this picture? I'm going to tell you a story now. In 1996, a graphic designer in his mid-60s by the name of Robin Ollington was walking through London. He walks down the Mall towards the building you see in this photograph, and he's very disappointed to find no illuminated Christmas tree. In fact, no Christmas tree at all. So, anybody recognize it yet? I'll give you another little clue. No one's being bold. That probably gives it away. So we're looking at Buckingham Palace. So what does Robin do? He writes to the Queen expressing his disappointment at having no decorated Christmas tree in front of the palace, never expecting to get a reply. 3 days later, he gets a very polite letter from a lady in waiting saying, "Thank you for your letter. I have shown it to the Queen and your suggestion has been duly noted." 2 weeks later, he gets another letter from another lady in waiting saying, "Thank you for your suggestion. You'll be pleased to know that next time you walk or drive in front of Buckingham Palace, you will see an illuminated Christmas tree, all thanks to your very sensible suggestion." And so the idea of having a decorated Christmas tree at Buckingham Palace only goes back to 1996. So thank you, Robin Ollington. Now, ladies and gentlemen, time is getting on. We're going to move on to one more section before I hand over to Simon, Christmas cards. Now, I'm sure this is a tradition that you carry out yourself. In Britain, we send about 700 million Christmas cards a year, about double in the United States. It'd be interesting to see what some of the latest figures are. But how long have people been sending Christmas cards? Well, in 1843, a man by the name of Henry Cole, who was then just an assistant in the Public Records Office. He would later go on to be the first director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, one of the world's great museums in London. And he has this idea to send greeting cards to his friends for the Christmas season. And so he employs an artist to help him with the design. And here is the original design from the very first Christmas card sent by Henry Cole. You'll see 3 branches of the Cole family in the center, this lovely watercolor image. Notice the children are drinking wine. That caused a few ruffles. You'll notice a line at the top to allow Cole to write in a message, and then a line at the bottom to allow Cole to write his signature. He thought this idea might have commercial potential, and so he printed 1,000 and sold them for £1 a card, which is about 5 pence, about £5 today. Quite expensive, but it was not a commercial success. But within a couple of decades, the tradition of sending a Christmas card to your nearest and dearest at Christmas was firmly a tradition in this country, and then eventually around the rest of the world. So what set the Christmas card on its journey to becoming this kind of favorite holiday tradition? Well, some important things. 1840, we get the invention of the penny post. All of a sudden, it's much cheaper, more convenient to send letters, parcels, and cards around the country. 1843, of course, Cole sends his Christmas card. Then we go into the 1860s, and we get printing, cheap printing on an industrial scale, because all of a sudden it's much, much cheaper to send cards all over the country and all over the world. And it's much, much cheaper to print them as well. But there is one more thing that I think I need to add in here. Within a week of Henry Cole sending the first Christmas card, a novel was published, a novel that would really reinforce this idea of the British tradition of celebrating Christmas and would almost single-handedly revive this idea. What novel am I talking about? Well, you shall find out in just a couple of minutes. Now, by the way, a copy of the very first cards sent was sold at Sotheby's in May 2001 for £22,500. So you're looking at the world's most expensive Christmas card. And just in case you haven't done your Christmas card shopping this year, a couple of other little suggestions for you. There is a company in Florida called Gilded Age Greeting Cards who do cards that have little gemstones in them, and they cost $10,000 per card. And they each come in a handmade box. So perhaps you might need a slightly bigger budget next year if you're going to go for those. And then just a few fun facts about the Christmas card on the screen now. Only 15% of cards purchased are by men. And another fun fact, in this country alone, every year we raise £50 million for charity by sending Christmas cards to our nearest and dearest. So, ladies and gentlemen, I gave you a little clue to part 1 and to part 2, and Simon has already given us a little bit of information on it. I'm now going to hand over to my lovely esteemed colleague Simon, and he's going to tell us about the creation of one of the most beloved and famous Christmas novels in history. Over to you, Simon.
Well, thank you, Pepe, and thank you for that wonderful introduction to Christmas. I feel very Christmassy already. And you'll notice, by the way, I'm sitting here in my Victorian home, actually, in southeast London, and I've got my scarf on and I've got my fingerless gloves. Why is that? Well, Charles Dickens said that to really get the authentic experience of reading A Christmas Carol, it should be read out loud in a cold room with just candlelight. Haven't got the candles on just yet, but so hopefully this Christmas you're going to be encouraged to read A Christmas Carol out loud. Maybe get your friends and family to join in, play all the parts. So I'm giving you the authentic experience. But in order to tell the story, we need to meet the man who was responsible. And here he is. This is 31-year-old Charles Dickens, painted in 1843. Now, were you surprised for me to tell you that that was Charles Dickens? Possibly, because we're so used to seeing Dickens as an older man, particularly with that beard, of course, which froze, by the way, one particularly cold winter. But he doesn't grow that for about nearly 10 years after he wrote A Christmas Carol. And this portrait is very important because it was painted in the late autumn of 1843, when Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol. And in fact, the first mention we have of him writing the story is in a letter whilst he's sitting to have his portrait painted. And it's a miniature portrait, actually, and it's by a relatively unknown Scottish artist by the name of Margaret Gillies. And it was exhibited at the Royal Academy on Piccadilly in 1844. And then it went missing. And in true Charles Dickens style, I'm going to leave you on that cliffhanger and come back to it at the end of my talk. So let's find out what is happening in Charles Dickens' life that year before A Christmas Carol. He is a literary superstar. He's the most famous writer in the world, and he's already published 4 novels. You might have read these as well. The first novel was called The Pickwick Papers, or The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, to give it its full title. That was his first novel. That was hotly followed by Oliver Twist, of course. I'm sure many of you will know Oliver Twist. And then the third novel was, in fact, Nicholas Nickleby. So actually, Oliver second, Nicholas Nickleby third. And then The Old Curiosity Shop. And the building that you can see on the right-hand side is a 16th century building right in the heart of London in Holborn. And we believe possibly that it was an inspiration for The Old Curiosity Shop. 1842, Dickens went to America on this rock star lecture tour, came back and embarks on a 5th novel. And he tells his publishers, this is the best thing I have ever written. This is better than all those previous novels. It's going to make us a whole lot of money. Here it is. It's called Martin Chuzzlewit. And you're all thinking, yes, I might have heard of Martin Chuzzlewit. Maybe I've read it. But for many people, that's maybe the one of the Dickens novels they haven't read. Don't worry, because actually people didn't get grabbed by it in 1843 either, because it just didn't sell as well as the previous 4 novels. It just wasn't as good, perhaps, as the previous 4 novels. What happened is, you might know, is that Dickens sold his stories in monthly installments to begin with, so a chapter a month, and the sales were typically 30,000, 40,000 copies a month. This started out well enough, and then it dwindled, 20,000 copies, 15,000 copies, and very quickly, the publishers, Chapman and Hall, are losing faith in their star author, and they threaten to reduce Dickens' salary by £50 a month. Now, Dickens is 31 years old. He's just taken a mortgage out on a brand new big house near Regent's Park. He's got the 5th of 10 children on the way. So he's got money worries. And interestingly, Martin Chuzzlewit is the story of a miser. So he's got the idea of a miser, and he's got the idea of, he's got money worries. So he needs something that's going to make him money. What's he going to do? Well, he's going to embark on a novel, and it's inspired by a couple of other things. And the first thing that fuels Dickens' fire is this image on the left-hand side of children working in Victorian mines underground in absolutely appalling conditions. Also children working in factories, working looms on the right-hand side. And interestingly, these illustrations, or the one on the left, was done by Margaret Gillies, and it accompanied a parliamentary report published in May 1843. And Dickens was perfectly stricken down by it. That's the language that he used. And then Dickens paid a visit to this location. And this is what was then known as Field Lane in the heart of London, in Holborn. This was one of the worst slums in the city. And Dickens knew it already because this is where Fagin had his den in Oliver Twist. And Dickens went to visit a ragged school, a school that was set up, schools that were set up for the education of poor children, but really they didn't receive much of an education, and Dickens was not impressed by it. So he has education and he has poverty and child labour uppermost in his mind. By the way, this is what it looks like today, Field Lane. It's called Saffron Hill, and today it's next to the jewellery quarter, Hatton Garden. So the neighbourhood has changed quite a lot since the 19th century. So Dickens sees that, and then he's inspired by a visit to Manchester, where he addresses a crowd of people about education, and he sees terrible poverty up in Manchester, and he now has this idea that he wants to deliver a sledgehammer blow on behalf of the poor children of Victorian Britain. And he said, I'm going to write a novel. And here it is. It's called A Christmas Carol. Now, all the previous writings have been done in monthly parts. Dickens says, I want this to be a complete novel. I want it to be beautiful. I want it to be bound in red cloth, as you can see here. This is a first edition. I want it to be have gold-edged pages, gilt-edged pages. And also, and we'll flip over the page and have a look inside, hand-drawn colour illustrations. So it really was a work of art. And actually, the idea was it was going to be a present that people could give to their friends and family. The problem is that you can't have something as beautiful as this and have it affordable at this time. So the publishers say we can't afford to publish it. At anything less than 5 shillings, which would be about £25 today. Now, if you remember, a Christmas card that Pepe talked about was a shilling, which would be £5. So this was 5 times the cost of the Christmas card. And they refused to pay for the publishing costs. And Dickens was furious. And so he said, right, I'm going to self-publish and I'll take a percentage of the profits. Thank you very much. That turned out to be a bit of a mistake because, in fact, the expensive costs of producing Christmas Carol actually reduced Dickens' profits. He'd aimed to make about £1,000, probably about £100,000 today, and he ended up with about £230, about £23,000 today. But nevertheless, it was written in an astonishingly short time because he had the idea. He approached the publishers in October, and it's no good publishing after December the 25th, is it? So he wrote it in 6 weeks. And by December the 19th, 6,000 copies were printed off in the first run, and they'd all sold out by Christmas Eve. 5 days sold out. Another 13,000 copies were printed. They were all sold out by the end of the year. Dickens had a phenomenal hit on his hands, but not at this point a financial success. But he will make eventually an awful lot of money, as we will discover later, from A Christmas Carol in a slightly different way. Right, on with the story. So this is the contents page. Now, just notice, by the way, it's written in a series of staves, not chapters. Why staves? Well, it echoes the musical theme of the story. It's called A Christmas Carol. And by the way, if anyone would like to have a guess or put it in our chat, does anyone know what the name of the Christmas Carol is that's referred to in the title of the novel? Because it is referenced in the story, only fleetingly, really, but it is there. So A Christmas Carol. What is the name of the carol? An extra mince pie for the person that gets it right. Now, Dickens sets the first stave in a counting house. And this is where we meet Ebenezer Scrooge, the miser, the protagonist of the whole story. Now, Dickens doesn't tell us what he does exactly, but he does work in a counting house. And this building is located in the city of London on Cornhill, and it's called the Counting House. Today, it's a beautiful, restored pub, but it was built in the 19th century as a Victorian bank. So this is the building that Dickens, we believe, has in mind for Ebenezer Scrooge's working premises. Now, there's another little clue which helps us, because just around the corner from the counting house, in fact, is this church. And this is St. Michael's, Cornhill. And Dickens says in the text that the counting house was in the shadow of an old church. And he says that the bell of the church was always peeping slyly down at old Scrooge from the Gothic window in the wall. Now, in the City of London, we don't have many Gothic-style churches. They're mostly classical Baroque style from the late 17th century, but this is one of them. And so we've put the Counting House pub and the tower together to give us the location. And of course, we can still visit these locations in real life today, as I did last Sunday on a Dickens walk, or the Sunday before last. It's at the Counting House we also meet Bob Cratchit, who is Ebenezer Scrooge's downtrodden clerk. And it's Christmas Eve, of course, and Scrooge knows that Bob Cratchit wants the next day off for Christmas, which would have been quite unusual because actually for many people in 1843, Christmas Day was still very much a working day. But reluctantly, he allows Bob Cratchit the next day off. He knows nothing about Bob Cratchit's personal life or his family circumstances, not interested. And we're very lucky, ladies and gentlemen, because we have very rare silent film footage of a silent film version that was actually filmed in that little network of alleyways that I just referenced. And here is a little bit of it for you, ladies and gentlemen. You'll be wanting the whole day off tomorrow, I suppose.
It's quite convenient, sir.
It's not convenient and it's not fair.
It's only one day a year, sir.
I suppose you must have the whole day off. Be here all the earlier the next morning.
Thank you, sir. Good luck, sir.
The clerk promised that he would, and with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, went down a slide on Cornhill 20 times in honour of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could at Pelt to play at blind man's buff. And that's Cornhill at the bottom of that alleyway. Now, after this, Scrooge takes his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. And look at the snow falling. This is Simpson's Tavern that we're approaching. It's just round the corner from St. Michael's, Cornhill and the Counting House. And it's been there since 1757. And it still continues to expand the waistlines of our city financiers today. Now, after Scrooge leaves the tavern, he heads home. And Dickens tells us that Scrooge lived in chambers. Here he is. Chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of buildings up a yard. And just look at the facade of this beautiful early 18th century townhouse, which is tucked away. You'd never find it. But luckily, as London Blue Badge tourist guides, of course, we know exactly where these places are. And here's an aerial view of the city today. That's the walkie-talkie building on the left that you can see Pepe indicating. But just there is a little arrow, and the arrow is pointing to where Pepe is circling. And that is that 18th century townhouse. And we're now going to show you the facade of it. And it's the address is number 4 Brabant Court. And you'd never find it if you didn't take a little right turn just by the walkie-talkie and head up, indeed, this yard. Dickens also references the old black gateway that led into the yard. And you can see, look, there's an old black gateway just to the right-hand side of the house. So it's so wonderful. The City of London, despite the fact we have all these 21st century skyscrapers everywhere, we still have these wonderful pockets of buildings that, of course, Dickens knew. And of course, he knew the city and the whole of London like the back of his hand because he walked everywhere. Now, we're going to advance the story a little bit now because, of course, we know that Scrooge is visited by a number of ghosts, Jacob Marley, his dead partner, and 3 further ghosts, the ghost of past, present, and future. Now, the Ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge to see Bob Cratchit's family and how they celebrate Christmas. And they live in Camden Town, as we've just discovered, because Cratchit runs home to Camden Town. But this is number 16 Bayham Street in Camden Town, a building which no longer survives. But this is where Charles Dickens lived when he was a child, 9 going on 10 years old. And it was really a sort of rundown tenement building on the edge of London at the time. And Dickens uses his experience of living here by placing the Cratchits firmly in Camden Town. Now, here's the Cratchits gathered round the hearth after they've had their goose on Christmas Day. They can only afford a goose, not a turkey. And also they've had plum pudding. And you can see just there Bob Cratchit raising his glass to the family. And there's little Tiny Tim just to his right with his crutch. And of course, Tiny Tim is Bob Cratchit's disabled child. And Dickens knew about disabled children because his own nephew, his elder sister's son, was in fact disabled. The family lived up in Manchester. So Bob Cratchit's so generous, he even manages to propose a toast to mean old Ebenezer Scrooge. And Scrooge is very moved when he sees the Cratchit family and Tiny Tim's plight. So moving the story on, because I think we're all familiar with the story, but now at the end, towards the end of the story, Scrooge has decided to change his ways. And he's visited by the final spirit, the ghost of Christmas yet to come, who actually is the most frightening ghost of all because he's a silent phantom. And Scrooge rather hopes that he's now going to be shown himself in a much more generous light. But in fact, the spirit takes him here. Now, this building is the Royal Exchange, and it dates to 1844. It was actually under construction when Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol, and the street to the right in the image is Cornhill, the street that we've already referenced. So all these locations in the city are really within just a few minutes' walk of each other. Now, the spirit takes Scrooge inside, because this is where Scrooge would have done his business with all the other merchants. And they encounter this group of very well-fed financiers, and they're discussing the death of one of their colleagues. And it turns out, in fact, that the person they're discussing is Ebenezer Scrooge. So Scrooge is confronted with the possibility of his own mortality. And then the spirit takes Scrooge to a dismal, wretched, ruined churchyard. And here we have again, just next to St. Michael's Cornhill, we have St. Peter's Cornhill, one of the oldest Christian churches, we believe, in the city. And this is where, very famously, if you remember, the phantom points to Scrooge's own gravestone with his name, Ebenezer Scrooge, on it. And now Scrooge, as you see, is absolutely overcome with penitence and grief and is determined that he's going to become a better human being. And he touches the spectre's hand, the ghostly hand, and the spectre vanishes, and Scrooge suddenly finds himself in his own bedroom and realizes that, in fact, it is Christmas Day and that he hasn't missed it. And the reason that he knows it's Christmas Day is because he leans out of the window and he asks a little boy out on the street what day it is, and the boy tells him it's Christmas Day. And he tells the boy to go running to the poultry market, or actually the poulterers in the next street, where the young boy buys the biggest turkey in the window, and that is the turkey that he sends to Bob Cratchit's house. And remember, turkey is significant because turkey would have been unaffordable to the Cratchit family. Now, moving on, just to finish off our story, we're talking now about the legacy of A Christmas Carol, because we know, of course, that it all ends rather happily. But within a few weeks of the publication of the novel, there were no fewer than at least 5 stage versions of the story. And at the Adelphi Theatre in London's West End, 1844 February, we have this version of A Christmas Carol. Dickens made no money from it because he had no control over the stage adaptations or the rights to the story. And by the way, at the moment, although our theatres sadly are closed, we had planned 3 different stage versions at least of A Christmas Carol this Christmas in London. So that's something to look forward to, hopefully, next year. I think one of them is being streamed live, actually, possibly. So anyway, we move on now to find out how Dickens made money from A Christmas Carol. So 10 years after he publishes it, in 1853, he's invited up to Birmingham to address a crowd of people on the 27th of December. And he decides, I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm going to read out loud from my own story. And this is a special edition of A Christmas Carol that Dickens had printed, where he marked it up, just like an actor would mark a script. And Dickens was an actor, and he performed A Christmas Carol. He didn't just read it. He brought all the voices and the parts to life. And in 1860, before we talk about 1867, this building you may recognize, this is the Dickens Museum, and it's located in Bloomsbury on Doughty Street. It's the only surviving London home of Charles Dickens, and it was open briefly in December. Well, it's closed again now, but it's one of London's greatest little museums. And one of the great treasures of the museum's collection is this reading table, which Dickens had made for those public reading tours that he embarked on in 1853. Now, in 1867, Dickens went back to America and embarked on 2, in fact, a series of reading tours. And famously, on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, 1867, he read from A Christmas Carol in Boston. And a factory owner was so moved by the story that he gave all of his employees the next day off, and he sent them home with, yes, a Christmas turkey. Dickens made somewhere in the region of $140,000 from the public reading tour in America over this period that you see on the screen. By the way, he was nearly arrested on the day that he came back to London in 1868 by the federal tax collectors because he'd refused to pay taxes on his income because the American government would not recognize international copyright. And of course, the figure of Scrooge does get parodied, of course, in our political figures. This is a current political figure who's been parodied quite a lot recently. And one can't help wondering if the federal tax collectors are going to be around in the next few weeks and months to come. Let's see. Now, finally, before we finish, this is the just several images of perhaps for many people their first experience of A Christmas Carol. If you've never actually read the novel, and I really urge you to this Christmas, you may have seen a film or a television version. Alistair Sim in black and white there played the great classic Scrooge in the 1850s, the 1950s. Albert Finney, who just passed away not too long ago, he played Scrooge in a musical version in the 1970s. My personal favourite, well, let's say my equal first favourite, is the one on the right-hand side. There's the Muppets Christmas Carol. I watch it every year with Michael Caine as a fantastic Ebenezer Scrooge. And some of you might know the Disney version, the very high-tech animation voiced by Jim Carrey on the bottom right. But my absolute favourite is the version in the middle, which was filmed in the 1980s, starring George C. Scott, wonderful American actor, as Ebenezer Scrooge. And it's very close to my heart because it was filmed in Shrewsbury in Shropshire, which is where I'm from originally. And when I was growing up, it was being filmed in the town. So I always like to look out for the buildings in the version. So I'm sure you've all got your own favourite versions. Perhaps you'd like to tell us which is your favourite version of A Christmas Carol in the chat. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, I wouldn't dare leave you hanging off that cliff, would I? Well, here is that portrait of Charles Dickens that, remember I told you, got lost after 1844. Dickens died in 1870, just 3 months after the last public reading of A Christmas Carol in March 1870. He was dead as a doornail at 58 years old. Hard to imagine, isn't it? And in the 1880s, the artist, Margaret Gillies, was approached and asked what had happened to this miniature portrait. And she said she didn't know. It was lost to her. Well, fast forward to 2018, and the Philip Mould Art Gallery in Pall Mall in St. James were contacted by a South African collector who had bought a box of junk, effectively, for £27 at an auction. And in this box of junk was this miniature portrait, all covered in fungus and mould. And they wanted the gallery's opinion on it. And the gallery started to clean it up once they got hold of it. And amazingly, this very handsome, charismatic young man started to appear from underneath all the fungus and the mildew and the mould. And they realized pretty soon who it was. It was that lost portrait of Charles Dickens. And rather like A Christmas Carol, there is a happy ending to this story, because in 2019, just over a year ago, £185,000 was raised by the nation, and the portrait was bought, and it's now the property of the nation forever. And it's in the Dickens Museum in Bloomsbury in Doughty Street. And it's on the in the study just across the desk from the desk where Dickens wrote his first 3 best-selling novels. And it's a wonderful reminder of a idealistic, passionate young writer who, quite frankly, I think changed the world through his writings. And on that positive note, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to actually ask Pepe to rejoin me to thank you all for listening today. And we can only end, really, with those wonderful final words of A Christmas Carol, where, of course, Tiny Tim, remember, who does survive, wishes everyone a Merry Christmas and says, Pepe,
God bless
us, everyone. And wherever you are in the world, ladies and gentlemen, whatever you're doing this Christmas, we wish you the happiest of Christmases from London. And here's to a healthy and more positive 2021.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was phenomenal, as always. We've had some lovely comments in chat. We've got people from all over the world in today. So hi to Julie in Liverpool. We've got somebody from Ukraine, from Virginia, from Kiev, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Norway, Catalonia, New York, Iguazu Falls, Brazil. So even somebody, we've got some people in Canada as well. That's incredible. So wherever you are in the world, we certainly hope that you have a fantastic holiday season. Don't forget that if you are missing London and you would like to perhaps have a virtual tour whilst travel restrictions are not allowing you to come, if you go to the Guide London website, guidelondon.org.uk, if you click on the tab at the top, London Virtual Tour, and then scroll down. You'll get lots of information about all of the different virtual, pretty much every major walk that is offered on our website is also offered as a virtual tour. Not all of the indoor venues, but there's literally hundreds and hundreds of options. So you can just fill that out. If you would like to find out more details about myself or Simon, so let me find Simon's details. Where are you, Simon? There we go. So you can look Simon up, /Simon Whitehouse. And if you want to look me up, you can find me /Pepe Martinez. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure to bring this special holiday Christmas presentation to you. Thank you to Simon for joining me today. We hope you all have a great Christmas, a fantastic New Year, and we hope that you all stay safe and well. And cheers, bottoms up, as we say over here. Thank you very much for listening today.
Merry Christmas.